Hey guys, how's it going? So today is class. Class. Let me teach you 4 terms that you should know. It's going to be on the test on Friday. So take notes. Monopoly, monopsony, oligopoly, oligopsony. Those are the 4 terms. See, a monopoly, we all know what a monopoly is. A monopoly is when there's a single seller of a good or service. Like, for instance, Apple iPods. It's a monopoly because only Apple sells iPods, right? A oligopoly is when there are few sellers of a particular good or service. And often, the people who are in an oligopoly, they come together to fix the price. An example would be OPEC. OPEC, what is it? It's a combination, a consortium rather, of oil exporting countries. It's right in the name. Oil producing exporting countries. And OPEC, what do they do? Well, before OPEC, the various countries in it, Kuwait, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and all the rest of it, they would compete insofar as selling their oil. And of course, competition drives the price down. But they came together in OPEC and they said, okay, you, Kuwait, are going to produce X number of barrels. You are going to produce, Y number of barrels. Saudi Arabia, Z number of barrels. And we're going to fix it at this price so that we all make a lot of money. That's the idea of an oligopoly, okay? An oligopoly, by definition, is short-circuiting the pricing mechanism, It doesn't matter the supply or the demand. The oligopolists have come together to fine-tune the price that they're willing to sell. And they all agree that nobody's going to sell at a lower price. That's how it works, okay? An oligopoly only works if the people who are in control of the market, the majority of the market in this case, none of them cheat. If they cheat, then the whole system kind of starts to crumble because there's price competition, which is what they don't want, right? Okay, that's an oligopoly, but what's a monopsony? A monopsony is when there's a single buyer, okay? Now, a simple example of this is U.S. government, see? U.S. weapons manufacturers, there are a bunch of them, General Dynamics, Raytheon, all the rest of it, but they only have one customer, the U.S. government, see? That's a monopsony, a single buyer in the market. And what's an oligopsony? When there are very few buyers, or a small group of buyers dominates the majority of the market, okay? And so they can if they come together as an oligopsony, they can control the price of a good or service that they are buying, see? And that way they can, of course, force the producers, who are multiples, to lower their price to meet the price that they are setting, see? It's the flip side of an oligopoly, where an oligopoly sells you something, an oligopsony buys something. Okay? Now, why am I giving you this little lesson that, as I insist, there will be a test on Friday, and it will determine 1/3 of your grade for the semester, so you better prepare. Anyway, the point of this is very simple. The Europeans and the Americans, the G7, they're hell-bent for leather on setting a price cap for Russian oil, see? Because the thing that just chaps their ass, that just drives them around the bend, is the fact that, see, the Russians, because of all the sanctions and all the rest of it, they started selling less oil than before the war. But the thing that drives them just bonkers, see, that, the sanctions didn't crush the Russian economy. On the contrary, what happened was that because of the sanctions, and because the Russians were selling less oil, and it was more inconvenient for them to reach the European market, the price of oil shot up, okay? And so what's happened, that even though the Russians are actually selling fewer barrels of oil per day, they are making tons more money. They're actually coming out ahead of this whole war, okay? The sanctions, far from hurting the Russians, it made them richer. This is a fact, okay? And it just drives the Europeans and the Americans, the whole crowd that's anti-Russia, it just drives them bonkers, They're like, how can Putler win like this all the time? So, They came up with, Janet Yellen of all people came up with this notion of a oil price cap, a Russian oil price cap. That this would affect only the Russians. See, shipborne oil from the Russians would be set at a fixed price. There have been some negotiations, and they were talking about maybe making it variable, but in the end, no. They want to make it a fixed price. The word that's coming out from the negotiations is that they want to set it at around $60, 60 odd dollars, which was the pre-war price. Okay, because they don't want windfall profits to fall into the Russians' lap, which has been happening for the last 8-9 months, right? And so they want to set this price cap. And they've been negotiating the rules of all of this. And okay, now the problem, what they basically want to do, the Europeans and the G7, the West, the collective West, the Americans and their little European minions, right? They wanted to create an oligopsony, a cartel of buyers, so as to push down the price of oil. Now, Russia is a huge player in the oil market, of course. It has. I forget if it's the largest or second largest, but it's among the largest reserves in the world. Their excess capacity that they sell is just ginormous. There's a reason that OPEC Plus exists. OPEC is OPEC plus Russia, and because they're a big player in the oil business. Mm-hmm. And so they want to set up this oligopsony. And what's the problem with this, though? Well, you see. And this is arrogance of the West. The West thinks that they're the civilized world and everybody else is just a bunch of savages. They don't seem to understand that, see, a good like oil, lots of other people want oil. And lots of other people have the possibility of buying that oil. Like, for instance, China. Like, for instance, India. India, since the start of the war, they've upped their purchase of Russian oil 5 times in barrels per day. I think, if memory serves, it's something like 1 million barrels a day that they're buying from the Russians. And the Russians, of course, are selling them at a slight discount. And so, for the Indians, it's incredibly attractive to buy Russian oil. Okay? And the Chinese are also buying Russian oil because they're not on board with the sanctions. And so, the Russians, all good, because, you see, the Europeans, the West, they are so arrogant as to think that they're the only buyers and that they can create this cartel, this oligopsony that controls the price of oil. And they're creating all these rules affecting Russian oil. That the Russian oil, once it's, it can't be sold on the high seas because in the oil business, a lot of times oil is in some tanker and it's going in transit from one place to another. And along the way, some trader will sell his position in that oil and it will become the property of somebody else, right? And they're setting all up the G7 with this price cap scheme. They're setting up all kinds of rules so as to make it impossible for people to do that, or that it has to remain at the price cap, all kinds of bullshit. Because the problem here is that the Europeans are not the major buyers of Russian oil. See? And so their scheme, this price cap, it's not going to work. And you know who's going to get hurt by it? The Europeans, exactly. Because what will happen is very simple. People in other places in the world, in India, in China, and everywhere else, they're going to buy this Russian oil at the market price. And they're going to flip it to the Europeans. And they're going to add a markup to it, inevitably. And so the Europeans are going to wind up buying the same Russian oil that they would have bought, but with this markup. And it's going to be enough of a bite that it's going to hurt the Europeans. And this is going to be despite the fact that they are deindustrializing. Because Europe, because of these sanctions, is rapidly deindustrializing. Do you know what that means? It means businesses are going broke. That's what it means. It's a very sophisticated term to hide the fact that European, especially German European industry and German industry is just going bankrupt. This is deindustrialization, okay? And so the Europeans, far from being a dominant buyer in the market, their share of the market is shrinking because all their industry is going broke. And so not only are they going to be getting the same Russian oil but at a higher price, see, it's not even their position insofar as the buying is concerned is going to shrink because of this deindustrialization. They are going to become even more marginal players in the oil market because of this price cap. I mean, it's pretty goddamn funny if you think about it. See? And people who know better have been saying, this is a stupid idea. Don't do this. This is only going to hurt you more. But, what's that saying about insanity? That is, insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result every time. Very well said. See, the Europeans are insane by that definition. Because just like with the sanctions, they think that this is going to hurt the Russians. But it's only going to hurt them. It's not going to hurt the Russians at all. And another key issue of this whole price cap is that the other big sellers, like Saudi Arabia, like Kuwait, like Oman, and the rest of it, they're not going to play ball. Oh no, see? Because they realize that if they do this to the Russians successfully, insofar as implementing this price cap, then the Americans, because really it's an American play, I mean, like I said, Janet Yellen was the one who came up with this stupid idea, and she's been pushing it, of course. Well, they're going to turn their attention to Saudi Arabia and try to implement the same kind of price cap. And what do you think? The Saudis are going to take this lying down? No. They realize what the game is. First Russia, then us. And so the Saudis are going to say, no. I don't know the word for no in Arabic, but they're going to say that. They're just going to not play ball at all. And in fact, it would be to the Saudis' interest to help hurt this price cap, this whole price cap scheme. It actually drives the Saudis closer to the Russians. And not just the Saudis, the other members of the OPEC cartel as well. Because they realize that if they successfully implement this against Russia, they're next. And they don't want that. They want to make their money, okay? And so what you're going to have is that the oil producers are going to do everything in their power to break up this emerging oligopsony. And like I said before, the key issue here is that the Europeans do not have a dominant position insofar as the oil market is concerned. So even if they make this buyer's cartel, they will not be able to control worldwide oil prices. Because there will always be buyers in other nooks and crannies around the world who are willing to pay the market price. Because after all, for instance, like India. See, India has quintupled its import of Russian oil. Why? Because the Russians, to incentivize the Indians, gave them very big discounts in their oil. And it was smart of the Russians to do that because it was going to be oil that they would have on hand but couldn't find buyers. And so if they offer it at a good discount to the Indians not only are they going to buy the oil, but they're not going to get on board the sanctions train either. That's one of the things that is driving the West crazy, that India, whom they thought was their buddy-buddy and all that, is not playing ball insofar as sanctions against Russia. Same with the Chinese, of course, but for different reasons that aren't important for this video. But the point. See, oil is, somebody once explained it to me very well. Oil is basically the illegal drug that the entire neighborhood is hooked on. You don't have to advertise it to sell it. You just show up on a street corner and the buyers will come to you. And the same with oil, and the same with the rest of the world. They need the oil. And so this oligopsony that the Europeans are trying to create, it's going to fail. It's going to hurt the Europeans more. It's going to benefit the Russians, and it's going to benefit the middlemen who are going to mark up the price of their oil products when they sell them to the Europeans. And since the Europeans have done all these sanctions against Russia, which is geographically their closest large-scale producer of energy resources, they're going to find themselves having to pay these excessive prices for this oil. Like, for instance, with the liquefied natural gas stuff. The French and I forget who else, the French and the Germans, they're complaining that the Americans are marking up their liquefied natural gas. Because before, of course, the Europeans were getting natural gas from the Russians through the pipelines. But because of the sanctions, no more natural gas. And so the Americans are like, sure, we'll help you out. We'll sell you our liquefied natural gas with just a teeny tiny markup. And it's like 5 times more. I mean, the Europeans are getting screwed. That's part of the reason they're being deindustrialized. Because European industrialization depended on cheap energy resources provided by Russia. Now that that's gone, because they sanctioned Russia, they're screwed. Their industries are going all bankrupt. The Europeans are getting poorer, a lot poorer. And like I said, I've said plenty of times, they're going to go cold, dark, and hungry this winter. And it's their own stupid fault. And it's pretty funny. But, all of this that I'm telling you, it's to tell you more or less what's coming up. And by the way, a final little note. This talk about how Iran is set to attack Saudi Arabia? It's all over the mainstream news, right? It's bullshit. It's bullshit, okay? Because, see, the Iranians and the Saudis, they hate each other for religious differences. The Sunni, Shia thing that goes back, centuries, right? Over 1,000 years at this point, I think. And so, yeah, they're at odds, at loggerheads. But they have been quietly talking to one another for years now, literally years, in Vienna. Because the Iranians and the Saudis, they're big oil producers. They have a lot of points of common interest. And they want to work together so they can keep on making money. So sure, publicly they'll say, oh, you so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. In public, sure, for political consumption. But quietly, on the down low, they're working hand in glove because they need each other. And so the notion that the Iranians are going to actually attack the Saudis is kind of laughable, but it makes a hell of a lot of sense if you think to yourself that maybe the Americans are going to start something as an excuse to put a whole bunch of American troops in Saudi Arabia. Because do keep in mind, the Americans, especially the Biden administration, they hate Mohammed bin Salman, the current de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. He's a young man, very energetic, very, very smart, and ruthless as they come. And he is the de facto leader at this time, likely to become the king. The Biden administration hates him. The Biden administration, Joe Biden personally hates him. And they actually want to put in as the king one of Mohammed bin Salman's uncles. And of course, if they were to do that, they would be able to control Saudi oil and get it to that nice price of $60-odd per barrel, which would be hugely beneficial to the American economy. See? And so, there are all these things that are going in play. And this that I just mentioned, the situation of Saudi Arabia and the Americans, the Saudis, Mohammed bin Salman, he is smart. He can see the future in the normal, rational way, not crystal ball, see the future, right? He sees the future. He understands his future is China, India, Russia. He has very good relationships with the Russians and with the Chinese. See? He's already pivoting Saudi Arabia in that direction. And so, a lot of people are saying that the Americans are going to put troops in Eastern Europe and fight the Russians head-to-head. Could be. Odds are good in that regard, right? But another place I think the Americans are going to put troops and overthrow the government is Saudi Arabia. Okay? And that would be just an ideal regime change there so they can get that cheap oil. I don't know, these are just some thoughts, some ideas I'm throwing out there, figuring that you should get a sense of what's really going on. Yeah, and by the way, test on Friday, 1/3 of your grade for the semester. Don't be late.